Part 3. Chapter 9. Relationship Status. The Osprey made it to safe wormhole distance long before the Imperial frigate got close enough for a detailed scan, let alone close enough to lock a tractor beam. To be safe, Jax dropped into local space a few times, changing course slightly. It was unlikely the Imperial ship would try to track them, but it paid to be safe. At least Jax thought so sometimes. Once the excitement of being chased off Thamura and avoiding an Imperial ship died down, Naomi told Jax about her conversation with Steve. Jax hadn't been thrilled, but it did make things a little easier aboard ship. The night before they arrived in orbit over Jebediah, Jax and Naomi came clean over dinner, or at least partially clean. They had agreed to keep her special skills under wraps a little longer, especially the running from the Empire part. Being able to evict the living computer interface from his berth was the highlight of the trip, as far as Jax was concerned. He missed his bed and his privacy. Corey and Naomi had agreed to share a room, allowing Steve some space of his own. Jax wasn't sure the two women sharing a room was a good idea, but it was better than him having an uninvited guest in his quarters. Both Jebediah and Thamura were in the outer territories of the Empire. Thamura was a bit more established, having been started nearly 50 years prior, long before the Unification War and rise of the Empire, by mostly colonists from the North American continent on Earth. Jebediah was a new colony, all things considered, only about 20 years old. The Empire founded the colony after the war, when a survey ship detected the molybdenum deposits from orbit. It was their first colony lottery. It was also the last, so far. Ever since, it had been a bit of a gold rush on the damp, rocky planet with families, small and large businesses, and everyone in between rushing to the planet to strike it rich. The lottery winners had been given a head start, but it wasn't much. The system's twin stars made wormhole travel iffy at best, forcing ships to leave their wormholes in the outer system and make their approaches at sub-light. It took a day of sub-light travel to reach orbit. The Osprey was orbiting the planet, while Skip built as accurate a model as he could of the surface, in particular the spaceport, the train line, and the ore depot and surrounding towns. Much of the population of the planet resided in the foothills of the mountain range that had been found to be full of molybdenum. Our first order of business is to get down to Abda and get a lay of the land. Ichiko gave me the name of a stockyard foreman to find and smooge for details. Said he was sympathetic to the small operators. He took a breath. We do know that the train is set to leave, he consulted his G-phone, in 2 days. That doesn't give us a lot of time, Steve said. He craned his neck towards the spiral staircase leading down to the cargo hold. I'll need most of the time to rig something up. I've been searching the internets for specs, but wouldn't mind getting specifics of what's in use down there. Lot of makes and models out there for ore cars. Jax nodded. That's your and Corey's main job once we touch down. Naomi and I will scout the town and find our mark. Corey pursed her lips. Why you two? She looked at Naomi with a knowing look that Jax didn't understand. Because, Naomi started, but stopped when Jax held up a hand. Because, he said, I'm in charge. He pointed to Steve and Corey. I need you two to get the rig built. Steve, you're our resident techie. Corey, well, you wanted to come along, so help Steve. He pointed to Naomi. She's got different skills. Steve and Corey exchanged a look, then looked at Naomi, who just smiled innocently. The knowing looks were weirding Jax out. He was going to have to talk to Naomi on the way to town. Everyone had been acting weird since the Mura. A thought occurred to him. Plus, depending on where our stockyard foreman falls, the two of us have a better chance at flirting our way into what we need to know. Naomi cleared her throat. I know you didn't just suggest pimping me out for information. Her look made it clear where she fell on that idea. Corey's face made her thoughts on it obvious as well. Jax held up both hands, opening his mouth to explain, but was cut off. Skip said, I think we're all set, boss. We can land whenever you're ready. The local space control folks in Selma are friendly enough. but curious why we're loitering in orbit. They've asked if we needed help with anything a few times." Jax nodded. "They bought our ident and cover story?" "Hook, line, and sinker," the SI replied. Jax smiled. "Be right there. Get into position for landing in Abda." "Copy," the SI replied. Jax looked at the others. "We're going the moment we set down. Get your shopping lists ready. Time isn't on our side." He turned and headed up the stairs. "Different skills, huh?" Corey asked. Steve was taking a sip of water and almost spat it everywhere. Instead, he had to double over from the coughing fit he was experiencing. Naomi looked Corey in the eye. "We all have things we're good at," she winked. Up on the flight deck, the flight controls slid into position as Jack sat down. He flipped a few switches and several of the monitors nearby came to life. Rudy from his station said, "I've got the plot. It's on your screen." Jax nodded. "Got it. What are we looking at? I know the spaceport is in Salma, so—" Rudy made his throat-clearing noise. "Yeah, spaceport isn't quite the term I'd use, even for Salma, and not at all for Abda. We'll be landing in a field, a muddy one at that." "Are there non-muddy ones?" Jax asked. "No." "Oh, goody," Jax muttered. The Osprey shuddered as she struck the upper atmosphere of the colony world. Plasma streamers began forming along the leading edge of the deflector shields. Jebediah. The boarding ramp dropped and made a sort of plop noise as it settled, then sunk an inch or two into the gray mud of their landing pad. From the ramp, Jax looked around. "Well, this is disgusting." He looked around, seeing the Osprey's landing gear settling into the muck. From behind him, Corey said, "I'm not stepping in that." From behind her, Naomi added, "Me either." "These are the only boots I brought," Steve offered. Rudy appeared at the top of the ramp. "A ground vehicle should be here shortly. I booked it to take you two into town." He tossed Naomi a data tablet. "That's got everything Mr. Ichiko provided on it." She caught the device and nodded. A few minutes later, what could only be described as a motorized cargo vehicle with oversized, knobby tires rolled up. It was automated, the onboard RI capable of driving the thing and nothing more. Rudimentary intelligences, or RIs, had no personality or feelings of any type. They were not self-aware. The cart moved as close as it could to the boarding ramp, but Jack still had to jump from the ramp to the vehicle. Naomi made the jump a bit more gracefully than Jack's. As she dropped into the seat opposite him, she reached forward and slammed her open palm on the cab. "Let's go." The vehicle beeped twice and accelerated away from the Osprey, kicking up a rooster tail of mud that clung to the underside of the infiltrator. Corey shied away from the spray, moving back up into the ship and pushing Steve ahead of her. The town of Abda, according to the Wiki Galaxia entry Jax had looked at aboard the Osprey, had a population of about 15,000 people, nearly all miners or in mining-adjacent fields. From what he could put together, plus what little Ichiko had shared, Abda was mostly small co-op efforts, plus a handful of large mining concerns. The co-op Ichiko represented was one of the mid-sized efforts. The town further up the line was mostly the larger mining conglomerates. The ground car came to a halt. The driver RI beeped 3 times, then 4 times. Jax looked at Naomi. "Do you know what it wants?" She shrugged. "Why would I? I don't speak droid." He looked at her, then raised both hands and wiggled his fingers. "You know, your computer talk mojo thing." She sighed. Before she could try to interface with the ground car's RI, Rudy said, "It's saying you're there." Through his earpiece, Jax looked around. "Really?" The ground car repeated its beeps. Okay, fine." He climbed out of the vehicle. Naomi followed. Thankfully, the actual roadway was paved and mostly free of glop. As the ground vehicle trundled away, Jax approached a grease-covered man in worn overalls. "Excuse me, we're looking for someone. Adamic? Tommy Adamic? He's a foreman at the depot?" The burly miner looked Jax, then Naomi up and down. "If he's the foreman of the depot, then I guess he'd be at the depot, don't you think?" He smirked and pushed Jax aside, continuing on to wherever he had been going. Jax frowned. "Rude." He raised his voice. "And the depot would be where?" From 50 feet away, the miner held an arm up, his hand pointed to the north. Naomi followed the gesture, then retrieved her G-phone from her jacket pocket. "Let's go. We can scope out the depot, and then see if our soon-to-be friend Adamic has a bar he likes. Guessing the workday here ends in about 2 hours. She held up her G-phone so Jax could see the clock. He nodded. The depot was on the outer edge of town, where the train line ran past on its way to Salma and the spaceport there. "There's mud everywhere," Jax complained, tapping his boot against a perimeter fence post. The depot sprawled nearly a kilometer of storage barns and stockyards. Men in power loaders wandered the grounds, moving immense crates of ore from barn to staging area in preparation of the train's arrival in a few days. Each crate and barn was labeled with the co-op or company the ore belonged to. Naomi watched. "So," she trailed off, lost in thought for a moment, watching the activity below. She pointed to a storage unit being carried by 2 power loaders. "Those must be the cargo modules that they load onto the train. Big." She turned and put a finger over Jax's mouth to stop the joke he was about to tell. "Can the Osprey lift one of those?" The modules were indeed quite big. It looked like each train car must hold 2 modules. The tops of the modules looked like they hinged open, likely how the ore was dumped in. In the distance, a heavy, large-wheeled vehicle rumbled. The back had a large rail-like protrusion, probably how the modules mounted onto it. Jax watched the 2 power loaders move the cargo unit into position near the rail tracks. He tapped his chin as he thought. "Not for long, no. We'll have to figure something out." He took his G-phone out of his pocket and began snapping pictures, sending them back to the Osprey and the waiting Corey and Steve. Naomi watched the men and women operating the loaders. "Bet 20 years ago, this whole place would have been automated, all droids." "I don't think this colony existed 20 years ago, but yeah, almost certainly it would have been mostly droids." He turned his head to look at her. "Say what you will, and I have a lot to say about him. The Emperor's hatred of droids and AI has pretty much zeroed out the unemployment rate." He scowled, thinking of the man responsible for his parents' deaths. "If someone wants to work, there's work to be had somewhere." "On a stinky mud planet, deep in a mine," Naomi replied. She looked at her companion from the corner of her eye. He hadn't said much about the Empire during their trip so far, and despite her admitting that she was the product of Imperial engineering, he didn't seem to be holding it against her. Back on the Osprey, Steve's G-phone buzzed. He and Corey were on the common deck having a snack at the small table set against the bulkhead. Between them, a tablet sat on the table with a schematic on it. Corey watched him take his G-phone and examine it. When Steve didn't immediately offer any details, she said, "What? What's going on?" She leaned over to see his G-phone. Steve offered his phone to her, then stood. "Hey," he looked at her. "What's the combat droid's name again?" "Baxter," the speaker in the ceiling offered. Steve looked up. "Thanks." He turned. "Hey, Baxter, care to join me in the hold? I want to work out some design ideas." "I'm already in the hold," the droid replied, his voice coming from the stairwell. "Let's meet our mark." Naomi walked back to the booth she and Jax had camped out in. She pointed to a middle-aged man sitting at a table in the middle of the bar with 3 other people, all wearing similar coveralls. The same logo they'd seen on the perimeter fence was stenciled on their backs. They had scoped out the depot for a while, then asked around for the bar that depot workers preferred. This one was their second stop. Naomi inclined her head. "The one with the loud laugh." Jax leaned over to look past her, just as the man in question released a guffaw that turned heads a few tables over. It seemed his laugh was well known. Several patrons turned to look, smiled, and returned to their business. He leaned back as Naomi sat down and grabbed her beer. "How you want to handle this?" he asked. The two of them had hung around the outskirts of the depot, taking pictures and readings of everything they could until they'd spotted a group of people leaving the yard. She looked over her shoulder a little, humming. She turned back to Jax. "What do we need from this guy?" He swiped on the screen of his G-phone. Her own device beeped as the screen came to life. She picked her G-phone up and examined it. "Okay, I'll take a crack at it." She looked at him. "This is not because you suggested it, and I'm not sleeping with him." She pocketed her G-phone and stood up and left. He watched her approach the table. Their target, a Dominic, and two other men and a woman all looked up and watched her arrive. She leaned on the table, making eye contact with the Dominic. Jack sipped his beer, flagging down a server. When the young woman arrived, he said, "Another round, please, and another order of onion rings." As the server turned, he added, "These are onion, right? Not eel?" She made a face, then turned and left. Naomi laughed what Jax thought might be her flirtatious laugh. He wondered why she'd never tried that laugh on him. It might have worked better than breaking and entering. He watched her sit down with a group of depot workers. Steve was standing in the cargo hold of the Osprey, hands on his hips, turning in a slow circle. He stopped to look at Baxter, who was standing off to the side, watching him. "Does a cargo door being opened during flight interfere with anything?" The combat droid didn't move, but said, "I didn't design the ship." "Do you know how much weight this winch assembly can tolerate?" He pointed to the equipment mounted to the ceiling of the hold. The assembly could telescope out of the hold in order to bring cargo aboard. Again, the droid didn't move. "No," Steve sighed. "You're not very helpful," Corey chuckled, putting her hand over her mouth. Finally, Baxter moved, shrugging his shoulders. "I'm a combat droid. You called me for help. I don't know anything about the technical details of the Osprey." The droid made a show of looking around. "If you have something heavy you'd like me to move, I'm your droid." Steve sighed and looked at the ceiling. "Skip?" "Yes, Steve." Steve rubbed his face as he groaned. "Have you heard the questions I asked Baxter?" "I have," the ship's SI replied. And would you be able to answer them?" "Yes." "God damn it," Steve screamed. "Now I know you're messing with me." He looked at Corey. "This is probably why the Emperor hates droids. They're dicks." Baxter made a clucking noise that Steve guessed must be his laugh. The matte black combat droid and the ship's SI replied in unison. "We are," Skip continued. "The design of the Valerian co-op infiltrator made cargo a secondary, at best, consideration. In fact, based on sales brochures from when the ship was in active production, the cargo hold was meant for crew use on extended missions. As such, opening the cargo doors during flight operations was not something factored into the design. However, Jax has opened them on occasion during atmospheric flight, and while it impacts flight dynamics, it does not hamper flight. The space frame is rigid enough to handle the stress." Steve nodded along as the SI replied. He opened his mouth, but Skip continued. "As for the winch assembly, the carrying capacity is primarily impacted by the tensile strength of the line, as the arms are integrated into the space frame. As such, each cargo arm can hold approximately 50 tons. Approximately." Steve looked up at the two telescoping arms and massive spools mounted horizontally next to each. Steve pulled his G-phone out of his pocket and did some calculations. "Okay, so we'll definitely need to grab the cargo module and drop it somewhere, then come back for the other. Gonna make this much tighter." He looked around. "I bet we can brace the arms." He pointed to a section of the hold aft of him. "There." Then he pointed to the forward edge of each door. "And there." He tapped his phone and then his earpiece. He grunted. "Voicemail." He slid his phone back into his pocket. Naomi walked back to the booth, grinning. Jax smiled and extended his hand to the beer he had waiting for her. Get what we needed? She looked over her shoulder. Adamic smiled and waved. 2 of his co-workers had left to play a game that involved a metal ring attached to a long string and a hook on a support pillar. They were swinging the ring, trying to get it onto the hook. She turned to Jax. Turns out our new friend Tommy Adamic's interests don't align with, she gestured to her body, this. Jax raised an eyebrow. She nodded. Yup. He leaned over to look past Naomi's slim figure. Adamic was smiling. I see. He picked up his beer and drained it, then grabbed the fresh one he had ordered for Naomi and stood up. Guess you might as well head back to the Osprey. He smiled. Don't wait up. He walked toward the waiting stockyard foreman and his remaining colleague. We don't have forever, she reminded. Let's plan a heist. Corey and Steve were sitting on the lip of the open cargo hold, feet dangling over the edge, watching the city. Each had a beer in hand. Naomi had returned a few hours prior in a rental buggy, like the one she and Jax had taken into town. Jax arrived on foot. When he spotted his friends up above, he said, The rental buggy shut off at night, apparently. He moved out of sight to the boarding ramp and stomped his feet to get rid of the mud that had accumulated, finally giving up and slipping his boots off. When Jax arrived barefoot in the cargo hold, Corey winked, her brown eyes twinkling in the harsh overhead lighting of the hold. Naomi said to not expect you until morning. Steve nudged her on the shoulder. Jax smiled and winked. Not everyone hits the sheets on the first date. Steve coughed. Jax added, Every time. He gestured around to the world beyond the cargo hold. Even if it'd be the most fun thing on this damp rock. You get what we needed? Steve asked, his composure coming back. Jax nodded. That's good. He turned to point to some recent modifications to the hold. Check out what we've been up to. He pointed to the 2 powerful extending arms in the ceiling. Corey and Baxter helped me reinforce each arm. He gestured to thick beams that had been welded to the arm assemblies and the deck in 2 places on each side, port and starboard. We also ordered some reinforced cable, but it won't get delivered until tomorrow morning. Should be a quick install, though. Baxter can braid it for extra tensile strength. Corey laughed. That should be fun to watch. Jax nodded. Great. He looked around. Naomi sleeping? Corey nodded. Okay, we should all hit the sack. Get a good night's sleep. We'll plan over breakfast. Steve and Corey both nodded. Baxter stepped forward. I'll go patrol. He turned his scatterlight toward the open starboard cargo bay door. Jax smiled. Careful, it's muddy out there. The droid grunted. I was made for combat. A little mud won't bother me. He turned to Corey. After I braid the cable, I can tackle your hair. Before she could reply, he continued to the lip and took a step, dropping to the muddy landing area below. Both doors began to slide closed. Corey looked at Jax. No, he did not just. A hand absently reaching up to pat one of her afro puffs. Jax shrugged and gestured to the staircase. He followed Corey and Steve up to the common area. The 2 headed to their bunks, Corey to the quarters she now shared with Naomi and Steve, to the room previously occupied by Mr. Ichiko, next to Jax's captain's quarters. Jax stopped at the kitchen for a glass of water. Rudy rolled over. Skip tells me that everything went well. Jax nodded as he drank. The rust-colored navigation droid rolled over to the small charging station in the bulkhead, next to the large entertainment screen. His head spun to look at Jax. You okay? Jax smiled. Yeah, all good. Just nerves before the job, I guess. Uh-huh, the droid said, non-committally. I'm sure that's it. Jax stared at him a moment. Shut up and charge. He headed for the hallway that led to the crew berths. As he passed the door to Steve's quarters, he knocked twice, then pressed the control on his own door. When he entered his berth, he left his door open. The following morning, Naomi and Corey walked into the kitchenette area. The ebony-skinned woman focused on setting the coffee maker to work. Her brightly colored fingernails were drumming against the machine impatiently. A few minutes later, as both women chatted over their cups of coffee, Steve walked into the common area. "Morning, all." He rubbed his dark brown hair, then ran his hand down his face. He looked at the two women, their eyes boring holes in him. A blush crept up his neck to his cheeks, forcing him to turn toward the cupboard. He busied himself with fixing a cup of coffee. Corey, tired of waiting for Steve to turn back around, said, "Good morning to you, too." Something in the way she said those 5 words caused Steve's cheeks to burn brighter. He was certain the back of his neck was on fire. He reached up into the cupboard to grab another coffee cup. Jax walked in. "Morn—" Steve shoved a cup of coffee at him. Both women turned their stares from Steve to a new target. Jack sipped the coffee, then looked at the two women. "What?" Steve sidled towards the lounge area, the long way around. Corey waggled her eyebrows, but said nothing. Jax turned and looked at Rudy, still in his charging port. "Rudy," Rudy made a mechanical sound, "if the hormone parade is over—" He disengaged from his charger and rolled to stand in front of the wall-mounted entertainment screen. "My understanding is that we need to get things planned." He turned to Steve. "They should deliver your order of cabling in 30 minutes. I'll have Baxter accept it." Steve nodded dumbly, looking from Jax to the droid and the two women, then the entertainment screen, and finally to the ceiling. The ceiling held his attention the longest. Once everyone had settled in, Jack said, "Okay, here's the deal. The train comes in tonight around 5. It takes 2 hours to load it up. Thanks to my new friend, Tommy Adamic, I know that for sure the lot numbers Ichiko gave me will be on this shipment. They've got loads from dozens of co-ops and larger operations going out on this train." He looked around. "Bad news is, we've got no idea where the lots will be. Tommy said it's semi-random based on load balancing the cars. Not every module is loaded the same. The train engineer and loadmaster provide a final layout when the loading is done and send that along to the yard managers in Salma." Naomi held up her hand. "Yes?" Jax nodded to her. "You sure you got the right lot numbers?" Jax shrugged, producing his G-phone. "Data file Ichiko gave me. We'll have to check each car. The lot numbers are only visible from the walkways inside the cars." He took a breath. "The train is expected to be almost 2 clicks long, so we'll have to move fast." "Not awesome," Steve said. "We're going to have to move real fast. It shouldn't be hard to hack the locking mechanisms on those cars, but moving the modules off, then coming back for more, gonna take time." Jax nodded. "Easier than you think. We'll head out after Steve and Corey get the new cabling installed. I want to be at the staging area well before the train leaves the city." He turned to Rudy. "Speaking of, got someplace in mind?" The small droid changed the density of his roller ball, allowing his body to bob up and down twice as he nodded with one fist. The main entertainment display showed an overhead map of the town of Abda and surrounding terrain. The G Applesoft logo was on the bottom right. He rolled to the display. "Here," a section of the map lit up with a red dot. "The train line," it lit up in blue, "runs right here, only a few kilometers away. When the train leaves Abda, we can be airborne and ready for intercept in minutes. This region is shielded from both cities by these hills. The Osprey coming and going won't attract attention." Naomi clapped her hands loudly. "Let's go rob somebody." Toot toot. The ore train arrived in Abda on schedule, right at 5 o'clock. Tommy Adamic watched the empty cars roll by until the 3-kilometer train came to a stop. He lifted his G-phone to his ear. "Ready in zone 2. His colleague, the woman who was at the bar with him last night, replied. "Zone 1 ready." The 2 other men from his table replied as well. All 4 loading zones were ready. Adamic pocketed his G-phone and turned to the nearest power loader. "Chen, go ahead and get ready." "Roger that, Tommy. The man strapped into the yellow and black painted power loader standing nearby said, before turning and joining another lifter to heft a massive cargo module onto the heavy loading arm of a crane that straddled the tracks. The crane was able to roll along the length of track inside the stockyard, loading the heavy ore modules onto the waiting train car frames. Men and women in power loaders all along the line were preparing cargo modules, loaded with molybdenum ore worth millions in Imperial credits, for the crane as it made its way along the track. "The train just left the station," Rudy said, then added, "and it's 3 clicks long." Jack swore under his breath, then nodded and tapped the intercom control. "Train is moving, so are we." He closed the channel and pushed the grav lift control forward, increasing power. The Osprey lifted off, its landing gear pulling out of the mud with a sucking sound. They had landed in a small clearing after Steve and Corey received their delivery of reinforced cable. Baxter had spent most of the morning braiding the thick cable to increase its strength. Down in the cargo hold, Steve and Corey were checking each other's safety straps. The cargo hold doors on both sides of the Osprey were open, and Steve's reinforced cargo arms were fully extended. As the ground receded and the wind picked up, Corey shouted, "Ready?" She had pistols strapped to each of her legs. Despite Jax's teasing that she had no value among the crew, her aim was top-notch and not limited to darts. She tugged on her own harness and walked over to the port side cargo opening. The ground, now 2 kilometers below them, was passing by quickly as the Osprey moved to get into position to intercept the train. From their headsets, Jack said, "Once we get going, we'll have maybe 2 hours before the train is close enough to Salma for the local Imperials to engage." Steve tapped his earpiece. "Roger that. We'll keep quiet. You sure your AI can fly this thing on its own?" He grinned. Skip cut off Jax's reply. "1, I'm right here, and 2, I fly better than Jax." "Let's not get crazy," Jax cut in, then added, "But yeah, Skip has this." The Osprey banked, and from the starboard cargo door, the view of the train line came into view. In the distance, the bright blue painted main engine of the train came around a bend, the kilometers-long ore train behind it. Jax pushed away from his flight console as the controls slid into their standby position. He turned to Rudy. "You two do got this, right?" Rudy made his nodding gesture. "Yeah, we got this." Jax nodded and headed down the staircase. When he got to the common deck, he saw Baxter. "You ready?" "Are you kidding? This has been the most boring job ever so far." The droid pounded a fist into his open palm. He led Jax down the stairs to the cargo hold. When they arrived, Corey handed Jax his harness, helping him into it. Naomi leaned out the open cargo door. "Ready?" Everyone nodded. She tapped her earpiece. "Okay, droids, bring us into position." "We have names," Rudy said over comms. "Moving into position now," Skip interrupted. The Osprey dipped as she dived toward position over the tracks. Below them, the train's engine approached, then whizzed past underneath. The Osprey accelerated and was over the train in seconds, maintaining position. The ship lowered until it was barely 20 meters over the train. I think we have a problem," Skip said. Everyone in the hold looked at each other. Jack said, "What's wrong?" "There's a car in the middle of the train. It's not an ore car, and sensors can't penetrate it. It could be anything." Naomi looked at Jax. "Your boyfriend mention anything about special cargo?" Jax held up a finger. 1, not my boyfriend. 2, no, he didn't. I have to assume he didn't know. The train was coming in from the town further down the line. Could be anything. He looked around. "Rudy, can you pick up any chatter? I don't like not knowing what's in that thing." "Scanning now," the nav droid replied from his station on the flight deck. "Nothing. All comms on that train are hardwired, and at least right now they're not talking to anyone over wireless," the droid said. "Damn." Jax looked around. "Okay, well, we stick to the plan. We'll drop on the last car and work our way forward. When we find the first car, Corey and Naomi will call down the Osprey. Baxter will get the car connected, and they'll take off. Steve and I will keep going and find the second car. Rinse and repeat." He looked at Corey and Naomi. "You two ride out with the ore module. Baxter, you stay on the train in case we need you." Everyone nodded.